As Western media is making it clear now, this is very much reigniting political tensions. As Reuters, that was the way they put it in their headline. When you're arresting an illegitimate coup president who is responsible for the deaths of at least 36 people, you really got to think about the political tensions, the political fallout. You hate to see things be so tense that someone might face justice for slaughtering at least 36 innocent protesters.
I mean, let the past be the past. I mean, why do they have to be
Mm.
like this? And all kidding aside, it's like PR. It's like they have to find some way to toe the very anti-Morales, anti sort of autonomous control line against everyone across Latin America and Central America. And so, how do you do that when this Anya's person who not only very clearly did a coup, but was also a total, like, unlikable, insane ethno-nationalist theocrat? How do you manage to frame that negatively? You go, oh, well, it's just all a mess. You sort of do a pox
Mm.
on both their houses nonsense, as if there's any equivalence between what she represented and what the Mas party represents. It's absurd.
Yeah. And of course, the right wing here is crying persecution. The media is kind of repeating this line that this is a persecution of the right, of political opponents. The headline from France 24 was Bolivia ex-president Áñez arrested in crackdown, quote unquote, on opposition. The Associated Press called it a crackdown. If this is a crackdown, it's a pretty restrained one. I mean, no protesters have been killed. As I said, I was out on the streets the other night. People were freely protesting this, and no one is fearing for their life right now. There's a judicial process that's playing out, and rightfully so. But I mean, it goes to show kind of the propaganda function of Western media, which is not something that exists in the form of journalists being told what to say. It just exists because of the natural sort of tendencies and biases under capitalism. It's the media tends to be sympathetic towards people on the right in Bolivia. If Western journalists travel to Bolivia, they're meeting and talking with people on the right, and they're staying in the wealthier neighborhoods, and that's who they're interviewing. And
You had a term for that. What was that, like parachutes?
parachute journalism, yeah. Yeah. Journalists who visit places like Bolivia, they're not going to the poor areas. They are not gauging the opinion of Morales supporters typically. And above all, they're just repeating the US State Department line or the British Home Office line, just repeating of the line of these intelligence services and the foreign offices of these Western nations who have always been anti-Morales and of course are anti-socialist. So that's the way that this propaganda is played out in Western media. It's just a natural tendency, really, if you look at what all the biases are towards in our society.
So we're talking about this broader Western narrative, right, that exists across US and Europe, which is why we're talking about France 24 and Deutsche Welle. We didn't go into much detail about Deutsche Welle, but that's like basically German France 24, and that as well is very much a sort of both sides-ish kind of narrative that they toe. And the most egregious of it actually comes from American outlets like the Washington Post and the New York Times. Like Washington Post says the coup in 2019 was alleged. Like the word they use is alleged. And the New York Times says many called it a coup. That's their phrase. And it's amazing because the whole thing that sort of maybe gave legitimacy to the power of Janine Áñez was the notion that maybe there was election fraud. And that narrative totally collapsed despite them towing that line at the time of the election in November of 2019, to the point where the New York Times basically shamefully admitted as much in June of last year with another story that while it didn't acknowledge the New York Times' terrible position from the year before, basically said like, oh yeah, it looks like there wasn't fraud in the election. Go figure. And so they've already admitted that position is not tenable. And now they're back saying, oh, many called it a coup. It was alleged it was a coup. Well, if you take power and after claiming that there was election fraud and there wasn't election fraud, I think that's pretty clearly a coup. I mean, what would they have thought? Do you think they would have had this kind of excessive even-handedness if Trump had been successful in taking over the Capitol on January 6th? Because, right. Oh, well, there were claims of election fraud. Like, no, it's not, no. And the way they apply this to Countries overseas, I mean, talk about looking down your nose at a whole country.
When it comes to foreign policy, international affairs, the mainstream media is just not willing to take a stance on anything really until they have the permission from the right people, which is basically the US State Department. They have to have the permission of their home governments before they are willing to take a side on something, which I think the evidence for is pretty clear now, that there was no electoral fraud, that this was essentially, it was a military coup. The military, I guess, kindly requested that Morales step down.
Yeah, at the end of the gun.
Yeah. And it's citations needed is the best at analyzing this kind of stuff. But, a lot of it is in the form of these loaded terms that are used, right? Like we're being told that this is a crackdown on the opposition in Bolivia. Would they describe it as a crackdown when Trump was impeached for the rioting at the Capitol? All these loaded terms. Regime is a big one. It's always the Maduro regime.
Yeah, it's not a country, it's a regime. Yeah.
It's a regime, right? Yeah. The state of foreign reporting is just, it's pretty horrible. Were there any other headlines you wanted to highlight here?
Well, I do want to look, I'm going to give myself a shameless plug for an old article I wrote on Medium, but I don't give a fuck. You should go and check it out just because I wrote it and I think it's good. This was back in 2019 when Evo Morales was originally forced into exile. And what I did was basically just go back through the New York Times' coverage of similar situations and coups in other countries, famous examples like Guatemala in 53, Chile in, 73? And then, how they covered Venezuela, the attempted coup against Chavez in 2002. Like, they're just chronically wrong with their reporting on this stuff. When you have politicians and media sources just in all kinds of situations where someone is always getting something wrong, you tend to lapse into this thought of like, well, are they stupid or evil, right? It's always along that spectrum, right? And with the New York Times, it's so clearly deliberate and malicious. Our establishment media, when it comes to foreign policy in particular, has no independence from the government, has never, ever shown independence from the government. I think Cenk Uygur, just talking about a different story, but one that I think is revealing about how establishment media covers foreign policy, right? They basically cover everything just the way the government wants it. And then every once in a while have a massive expose that gives them just enough credibility for you to keep coming back, right? Like the Washington Post, what was it, last year, maybe a year and a half ago, they got leaks of Afghanistan war logs, and they showed how the whole thing's been a disaster from day one. No one knew what the overall mission was, what they were there to do, etc. How it's just been a total mess for the whole time that we've been there, right? This was a story broken by the Washington Post, and it's very, very valuable. But guess what? Next week, when the Pentagon has a press conference about what's going on in Afghanistan or about what's going on anywhere, the Washington Post is going to dutifully toe their line. They're not going to have a critical perspective despite this wonderful expose they put out. And so that's, and you can apply that across the board when it comes to foreign policy.
Yeah. And again, I think it's just once you understand the factors at play behind particularly international reporting, it all makes sense. Everyone has a bias. Everyone has a class interest and a class perspective. And who do you think the people are that the New York Times, for example, is hiring to do foreign reporting? I mean, in general, rabble-rousers and socialists who think that the United States can be a malignant force in the world, they don't go to Columbia Journalism School and get hired by the New York Times. People who are sympathetic to leftist and socialist movements in Latin America are not the kind of people who tend to get hired by the New York Times. You can go and check the portfolio of work by any one of these journalists that report on these things in the New York Times or the Washington Post, and you can see their track record or even look back decades, as you were talking about it, all of these dictatorships in the past throughout Latin America and all these atrocities that have been committed in the past. And you can just see how they've just repeatedly dropped the ball.
And when it's that consistent that they drop the ball, it's no accident. It's no accident. They're using their credibility as a supposedly independent source from the government or from specific interests within the government. We have this false veneer of separation when it comes to that stuff that is really not warranted. You're not going to find that critical coverage there. And yeah, as you pointed out, the journalists that do provide that coverage don't reside at the New York Times. And in their partial defense, I would say they don't reside there anymore. There used to be Cy Hirsch at the New York Times. There used to be Chris Hedges at the New York Times. They had some give there. And even those kinds of voices have steadily been exercised from the newsrooms there. You want real kind of coverage, you got to look for independent sources. You got to look for people with Substacks and Patreon accounts. And this is something that establishment types clutch their pearls at. But you know what? They're doing the coverage, and they're doing it in a more defensible way.
Yeah, well said. It's something that annoys me because, I mean, these are matters of life and death for these people down here. There were at least 36 people who lost their lives because of this coup in 2019. And it really is frustrating to see that not only are they facing the atrocities that they're facing here in Latin America and the abuses of these right-wing figures, but they can't even get a fair shake in the foreign media. And I think if you're talking about leftists in Latin America and socialists, these people know what they're up against. And again, these are people who are in situations of life and death down here and really put a lot on the line to try to achieve progress in their countries. For them, I think it's probably just par for the course. The biggest issue for activists in Latin America is not that they're not being given a fair shot by the New York Times, because they're never going to be. But it is frustrating for an American audience. I would like to think that these people could have some sense of solidarity and support, or at least acknowledgement of their struggles from at least self-avowed leftists in the United States. But far too often it doesn't happen. And it's precisely because of the biases of our media, which I think sometimes people just haven't learned to see through.
I think the people who will get a fair shake or flattering take from the New York Times will be those who find a way to sell Bolivia's lithium to Elon Musk. I think that's when we'll see a glowing portrait. Elon Musk will back some faction down there and they'll set fire to some building and they'll have freaking like neon pink uniforms or something like that. It's always some weird shit like that, right? Like the Pancasilas had in Indonesia had like orange camouflage, like it's like some soccer team's away jersey or whatever the fuck. It'll be like some weird color like that. And they'll be like, oh, Bolivian freedom fighters take action. That's when you'll see a gushing headline, when it's firmly in the bag like that.
Yeah, well, that's what
a definite line to toe.
Oh, that's what it is. There has to be some authority figure that gives them permission to cover these things in a flattering way. I mean, whether it's, you joke about whether it's Elon Musk or but it has to be some kind of, like, in their mind, an authority figure that gives them permission to report on these things in a certain way. I mean, it continues to be a pet peeve of mine that there's not more solidarity from the United States. I mean, now that Biden is in the presidency and is, in theory, a little bit more persuadable, at least, than Trump would have been on certain things. For me, it's like, where are the protests against the sanctions in Venezuela that are killing tens of thousands? If someone knows about them going on, I'll gladly do all I can to promote them and be a part of them and help to make that a success. But I think far too often there is just kind of a inward-looking nature with the left in the United States. And
I think there's something to worry about here on that front. When the United States wants to sanction a country, it'll be as capricious as it likes and will use the media to fan the flames on whatever that issue is. And Janina Áñez did a coup and murdered dozens of people. All of the hallmarks of someone who should definitely be in jail once she's out of power are there. And yet, I wouldn't be surprised if the State Department, the European Parliament, the forces of Western sort of transatlantic power structure writ large. I wouldn't say this is necessarily a prediction, but if it happened, it wouldn't surprise me if they come out with a statement condemning political persecution of the opposition and all that, to then maybe sanction Bolivia now. This could be, this sort of coverage over time with actions abetted by those forces could lead to a sanctions regime. And it's going to all be because Bolivia doesn't want to give us lithium for nothing, that they actually want a fair price for it.
Yeah, I'm really holding my breath, hoping that that's not going to be the case. We've seen from multiple case studies. I mean, Iraq in the 90s and Iran now. I mean, just the real damage that sanctions can do to a country and can do to people.
Yeah, it's crippling. It's totally crippling.
So, yeah.
I mean, also, one thing we also have going for us on this issue is that, so there was all this big to-do about the elections in 2019 and how they were potentially marred by fraud, etc. But with the ones that put Luis Arce in power, there weren't even such accusations. Like he was elected, and most of Western media, after having been caught by researchers who looked at the election data in 2019, found it all to be above board, they weren't about to accuse willy-nilly the Bolivians of committing election fraud again in 2020. So they have that going for them as far as having demonstrated very recently that they can go through a political process like a normal country.
I think journalists covering Latin America, covering foreign affairs, I mean, they could use a healthy dose of cynicism. They should probably read Devil's Chessboard. They should realize the role that Western intelligence plays in shaping perceptions of these places, and down to shaping this entire, completely unsubstantiated narrative of fraud in these elections here. And it's nothing new. This is what, happened in the 80s when the Sandinistas were democratically elected in Nicaragua. It's all of a sudden the State Department was insistent that, these elections are illegitimate. These were unfair elections. And meanwhile, there were elections in other countries that were electing right-wing allies of the United States, and their elections were deemed to be free and fair. Yeah, I think these reporters could use a healthy dose of cynicism and independent thinking and probably a history lesson.